It is now time to learn to pin and sew two pieces of fabric together with a seam. Find the set of 3 lines below the curved line. The center line should be marked as a cut line. Using fabric scissors, cut along the line marked the cut line. Place the 2 pieces of fabric right sides together with the cut edges matched up along the top. The stitch lines should be visible from both sides. Match the sides of the fabric and begin to pin along the line. Push a pin straight down through the top layer of fabric through the center of the line. Check that it goes through the stitch line on the back layer of fabric as well. If needed, adjust the back layer until it does. Hold the pin upright and use a second pin to pin along the line. Be sure to place the pin in at an angle. If you place the pin straight up and down and then turn it, the fabric has a tendency to slide apart in that direction. This is especially problematic if you're using thick fabric. Pin the other end of the seam in the same manner. Continue to place pins along the seam. Because you have established the beginning and end point, you can probably place them in at an angle along the line. Be sure that the front and back stitch lines still match, and that the fabric lies smooth across the entirety of the seam. The 2 layers of fabric have the same seam allowance, so the edges of the fabric may match in this case. But what you should be following and matching is the stitch line. After you have pinned the stitch line together, it is helpful to place a couple of pins vertically across the stitch line to help keep the fabric from shifting forward or back during sewing. Check your machine settings. The stitch width should be set to 0 and the stitch length should be set to 3. Place the fabric under the presser foot. The seam allowance should be on the right. Center the stitch line below the needle. Lower the presser foot, hold the beginning threads, stitch 2 or 3 stitches, back stitch 2 or 3 stitches, and continue sewing along the line. Sew until you reach a pin, stop and remove the pin before continuing to sew. Even the pins placed perpendicular to the seam can cause damage to the needle if they are hit. It is always safest to remove the pins before going over them. Whenever possible, the smaller edge, which is usually the seam allowance, should be on the right. There is limited space to the right of the presser foot because of the sewing machine, while to the left of the machine is open and there's much more table space. Stitch until you reach the edge of the fabric. Backstitch 2 or 3 stitches. Stitch forward till you reach the edge of the fabric. Make sure the needle is in the upright position. Lift the presser foot, pull the work out, and clip the threads close to the work. Also clip the threads at the beginning of the seam. Take the project to the ironing table. Place it flat on the table. Press the stitching. This helps to release any tension in the thread and sets the seam into the fabric. Open the fabric and place it wrong side up on the ironing table or sleeve board. Use your fingers to gently open the seam allowance. Use the tip of the iron to press that seam allowance flat and open. Be sure to use the steam button to release steam while pressing. Check that the seam allowance and seam are completely open and lying flat against the table. Turn the fabric over. If needed, use the iron to gently press out any creases or folds that may have formed on that side. Keep in mind that if you are ironing something that is delicate or has very thick or textured seam allowance, it may be necessary to take precautions to prevent the edge of the seam allowance from creating a ridge on the right side. You have finished sewing the straight seam and are ready to move on to the facing.